Thank you. You can see my screen, I hope. Okay. I want to start by saying that I'm very excited and very scared to be here. I'll start by explaining why. A year and a half ago, I learned I'm autistic. Almost 65, and apparently very good at masking. So I'm recovering from autistic burnout and complex PTSD. My autistic burnout was severe enough that I no longer drive and I no longer travel alone. But I'm hoping that I'll be recovered enough to join you all next year. But I can still teach and I can still do my research because I have a great family. And because my research is now focused on autism in the academy and is funded by SSHRC, so it's pretty hard to suggest that my research isn't relevant. I do acknowledge the land on which I'm sitting, which is the land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I respect the treaties that were made on these lands. I acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present, and I dedicate myself to move forward in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. So this is my title, but truthfully, I think that the subtitle of my talk is the weaponization of respectful learning and workplace environment policies, which I guess is sort of how I fit into this more legally oriented panel. I'm actually glad the first two presentations went together because I'm kind of different. I am an applied linguist and I am an autistic distinguished professor. My research focuses on discourse, governance, and institutional workload in higher education. And I've been doing that for a number of years. A lot of the questions that were raised for me in my research on the U15 were around workload and institutional branding, but it led me to questions about how universities regulate communication, credibility, and professionalism. So I'm building on Kenneth Westhew's foundational work on academic mobbing, but I'm trying to bring a discourse-oriented perspective here, and that it will incorporate ideas about institutional government. Some of these issues remain subject to ongoing legal and institutional processes, so I cannot discuss everything or even anything openly. That said, my goal today is not to adjudicate any individual case, but to contribute to the development of theory. I seek to extend existing theories of academic mobbing, examining how institutional discourses, communication differences, and neurodiversity shape the processes of credibility and delegitimization. So there's just a little bit of a history here. I'm white appearing, obviously. I am a settler on Turtle Island. I was brought up native English speaking, but my roots are Siberian, the indigenous Yenisei of the Yenisei River Valley, and Scots Gaelic, and I'm married to an indigenous person. Anyway, I have been diagnosed and tested and evaluated many times, and it is absolute that I am autistic. So, and I don't interpret social communications accurately or well, and so I had an extreme overreaction when I couldn't get onto the link so that I could present my paper, and for that I apologize to anyone who was affected. Like I freaked out. Anyway, I'm going to start by getting you to imagine a context, and this context is in 2024, a highly respected 27-year veteran, tenured professor at a Canadian research university who had never experienced so much as a reprimand, was suddenly placed on interim measures following solicited formal complaints, primarily from administrators, but also colleagues and students, alleging incivility, intimidation, and harassment. The measures included a campus ban, contact prohibition on or off campus of any member of the university, and restrictions affecting family members who also worked or studied at the institution. A 1-year-long investigation followed. The investigation report described a consistent pattern of behavior, contributing to a toxic environment, despite acknowledging that the underlying conduct consisted of direct communication, insistence on procedural clarity, reading aloud prepared written statements at meetings, and persistence in raising governance concerns. Months after the investigation began, the university received medical documentation confirming that the professor was autistic. The investigator had not been informed. Independent psychological and psychiatric assessments later concluded that the behaviors characterized as hostile or threatening were consistent with autism-related communication traits, exhibited no mental illness other than those resulting from investigation trauma, and did not meet clinical definitions of harassment. Despite this, discipline was imposed. Throughout, interim measures restrictions persisted, ultimately lasting 2 years. Requests for an autism-informed restorative return to work process were declined. This case bears the hallmarks of what Westhus and Seguin describe as academic mobbing, the collective formation of reputational narratives, administrative amplification of fear, and the transformation of social discomfort into institutional sanction. But here, rather than adjudicating the factual disputes underlying the complaints, my presentation analyzes the various discourses through which civility, respect, and professionalism were mobilized to convert perception into discipline. So the research question is, how does language transform perception into administrative fact? How does the process happen? And how does social exclusion and rumor result in discipline or termination of a target? As I've been listening to all of the research and discussion here, I've realized that my analysis may be applicable to other forms of neurodiversity, not just autism, and other forms of difference that may result in communication difference, such as cultural or gendered or class differences, or use of a stigmatized speech or accent. And I should probably insert at this point that I am one of those postmodern, post-structuralist folk, and I hope I'm a good one. So anyway, traditional mobbing, or academic mobbing, is distinct from traditional bullying. I think we all know this, and there's not really any need for me to go into this at length, except that I do want to focus on the particular definition I'm working with, which is that it's a coalition of many aggressors, that there is reputation battering, and then there's multiple processes such as respectful workplace environment policies, or responsible conduct of research or ethics, or some form of decredentialing. And it's organized around social consensus and often implements organizational procedures that might be polite and bureaucratic on the surface, but they are intended to eliminate, humiliate, and degrade the target. Westhus, I'm sorry, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, documents the formation of a collective impulse to eliminate someone, or in the animal kingdom to kill, noting differences that can create targets. And some may be, tracked to envy of productive, independent, successful, intelligent, high-achieving professors, evidenced yesterday and earlier today in the presentations. There's shared a collective aggression, and then it enacts bureaucratic rituals. Then, so social elimination is achieved through ostracization, gossip, reputational damage, and there's often administrative participation. I actually was intrigued by the question. So, like, I think it was Kevin who raised it. When did this start? Like, in many cases, I would guess it started when employment started. Like in this case, 27 years ago, and could be linked, for instance, to meetings in which, and this is going back to Heliana, meetings in which a professor wanted to be acknowledged for breastfeeding, or then failure to recognize accomplishments. But anyway, sorry. Um, and so my goals here are to enhance and nuance these theories by illuminating the linguistic processes and mechanisms that contribute to mobbing, and how policy language can be weaponized. And I also wish to expand Seguin's focus on organizations and on negative communication. There are two kind of statements, which is that civility is not simply an interpersonal virtue, but it is a relation of power. So it has shifting meaning, and respect is normatively defined. It can become a tool for enforcing conformity rather than engaging and sustaining like a pluralistic society. Governance happens or is enforced through discourse. When I teach my classes, because I'm applied linguist, I always tell my students, in order for us to teach anything to anyone, or our thoughts have to go through language to get there. So everything happens through language. I'm building on scholarship in critical discourse analysis, so CDA, and disability studies, often called CRIP theory, and theories of institutional government. I see things in terms of macro, meso, and micro contexts. In academia, ideological discourses produce exclusion because they render autistic communication styles, or any communication style of difference, I think, incompatible with university life or the community that we are trying to build in academia. So at the macro level, the level of ideology, the ideologies are not just reflected, they are produced through language. So we have a lot of common sense linguistic categories like academic freedom or pursuit of knowledge, collegial governance, in the vanguard, nowadays, anti-racist pedagogy, decolonization, or accessibility, and then they become quite rigid. They can foreclose alternative ways of knowing and being, which we've seen in the cases of people who take contrary stances to those people like me who think of themselves as warriors for social justice. In higher education, these frames can be used to support neoliberal or colonial or even petrocapitalist logics. So universities are corporate actors, and individual humans and non-humans become expendable. So there's nothing personal in ideology. But there are norm-based definitions or ideologies of professionalism, credibility, belonging, respect, civility, reasonable, productive, and of disability. At the meso level, we have a bridge. These are how ideologies are enacted through institutional genres and rehearsed scripts, things like policies that regulate participation and credibility and belonging. So complaints or investigative reports, our performance reviews, our tenure reviews, anyway, policies, and these govern not just the words we use, but also our tone, the amount of deference we show, our affect, and how we deal with emotion. I've here looked at two, which I think are particularly relevant to situations of mobbing. Often there is like the scripts of servitude, which is when you are not in a position of power, you're expected to show deference or apology, be subordinate, suppress your emotion, um, show gratitude, consent to being surveilled. And all of these things are preconditions for legitimacy. You have to engage in these linguistic behaviors in order to be deemed credible if you are belong to a subordinated group. And then there's scripts of supremacy, which define reality, objective experts, and that they demand compliance. And this would be your comment about HR. I think it was Stephen. They exercise authority and they're not subject to scrutiny, but they're communicative rights that are invested in power or in dominant category groups. And finally, there's the level of the micro or the word choice and tone policing. And words like persistent, oops, sorry, how do I go back? There. Words like persistent or aggressive, escalatory, unprofessional. The target is you, through these words, the target may be constructed as a source of fear or and that leads others. I think someone answered me in the chat about how people can convince themselves that they're doing good things by complaining about the target because they use this kind of language and then say that creates withdrawal or silence or disengagement or fear or feelings of being intimidated or harassed in themselves. So I bring up the question then, what if these are just reads of misperceived autistic communication or misperceived other forms of neurodivergence or other forms of difference? And so I looked at, I'm looking here at what are some of the communication characteristics. Now, I said this is like Yergo 2018. In fact, he doesn't go through like this. This is kind of me putting things together, but this is the kind of thing that is being researched in disability studies. So, like direct or literal language can be constructed as abrupt or rude or confrontational when it's simply just stating the truth as an autistic person sees it. Or an autistic's need for precision or clarity is viewed as nitpicking or argumentative or escalatory. Correcting of errors, something that autistics are prone to, is seen as challenging authority or insubordinate. Asking questions is difficult or resistant. And something here that I think is particularly in need of examination is that, autistics and other neurodivergents are actually known for extreme honesty and extreme forms of rule following as opposed to flagrant violation of rules. But that can be seen as naive or disruptive and create additional hatred. And it does put autistics in a situation where they need to out themselves to people who are not friendly and expose themselves to some of the vile discourses that are occurring under a certain member of the United States administration. And autistics also need additional processing time. So it's hard to process a question in real time and answer it, but that can be viewed as evasive or lacking confidence. And here I would encourage people to read a lot of the stuff about giving testimony and why it is so important for in an investigation or in a court situation for people to understand, or for the judge, the jury, everyone to understand the characteristics of autism.
Sandy, you have about a minute left if you can wrap
Okay,
things up.
So, anyway, autistic communication can become a general pattern of behavior, which then leads to delegitimization. And an autistic person can be aware something is amiss, but unable to identify what. So, I am trying to make a case for what I call the delegitimation cascade, which is that ideology becomes normed expectations, which then a difference from the norms becomes visible, and then that difference is interpreted negatively, so, and that felt rude or that person is intimidating. And then there's social amplification, and this is the mobbing that West Hughes talks about, personal procedural initiation, and a search for evidence, organizational validation, administrative fact, and then institutional exclusion. So what changed? There was no change in behavior. Behavior may be, in fact, more restrictive, but perception somehow became evidence, and evidence became fact. So the implications here are that autism, actually, I learned, is often found in academia, and it is a form of difference that unions, faculty associations, and lawyers should consider in many on one, so that would be like collective against one situations. Once a process is formally initiated, each stage makes the next stage more likely and harder to avoid. Institutional legitimacy is actually produced through the legitimation of an autistic target, and mobbing may not only occur once. In fact, autistic people may not recognize that they've been mobbed for 25 to 27 years. But an initial social exclusion can be followed by a second wave after the target seeks help, and then even a third wave should the target be fortunate enough to return to work. Um, and the return to work may simply be a restoral of the initial status quo, social exclusion, isolation, and rumor. So, anyway, I am like others. I'd love to talk about next projects. So, thank you.